Lesson 5, the Pythagorean Theorem. A right triangle is a triangle with one right angle. The legs are the sides that form the right angle. The hypotenuse is the side opposite the right angle. It's the longest side of the triangle. So we're going to complete this graphic organizer and label the legs and the hypotenuse. So if we look at the three angles, A, B, and C, the only angle that could be a right angle is letter C. So I'm putting like a little, it almost makes a box shape. That indicates that's the right angle. The legs are the sides that form the right angle. So here is a leg, and here is another leg. The hypotenuse is the side opposite the right angle. It's the longest side of the triangle. Well, just by looking at it, this side looks like it's the longest side. The other little trick you can look at, your right angle kind of makes an arrow, and that arrow points to the hypotenuse. So sometimes that's helpful to look at it that way. So if you were to actually measure this in centimeters, angle BC would be 4 centimeters. Angle CA would be 8 centimeters, while side AB would be 10 centimeters. So if you notice, the longest side is side length AB, which is in fact our hypotenuse. So for real-world length, when viewed from the side, the shape of some wooden water ski ramps is a right triangle. So that just means if you look at it from the side, you get kind of a right triangle. Suppose the height of the ramp is 3 feet, and the length of the base of the ramp is 4 feet. How long do you think the ramp will be? And explain your reasoning. Well, it really just depends, but I'm just going to guess that it's 5 feet because it has to be longer than 3 feet or 4 feet. It has to be the longest side, and 5 is larger than 3 and 4. Pythagorean theorem key concept. So in a right triangle, the sum of the squares of the lengths of the legs, meaning a squared plus b squared, is equal to the square of the length of the hypotenuse, which is c squared. So the legs are always going to be labeled as a and b, and the hypotenuse is always going to be c. So we'll be using a squared plus b squared equals c squared for all of our problems. The Pythagorean theorem describes the relationship between the lengths of the legs and the hypotenuse for any right triangle. You can use the Pythagorean theorem to find the lengths of a side of a right triangle when you know the other two sides. So I'm going to take example number 1. I'm actually going to redraw it off to the top left. So I have a 12 inches, 9 inches, and then I have C inches. I want to label all my sides. I'm going to identify my hypotenuse first. Well, my hypotenuse is going to be the longest side. Well, C, 9, and 12 doesn't help, but it does help to know that it's the opposite of the right angle. If my right angle is right here, that means that this is going to be my hypotenuse, which is labeled as C. For A and B, it doesn't matter which one is 12 and which one is 9. Just label it however. So I'm going to make 12A and 9B. And I'm going to use the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. A squared, which is 12 squared, plus B squared is 9 squared, equals, we don't know C, so we keep it as C squared. 12 squared is 144, plus 9 squared, which is 81. I'm going to keep solving on the left side. If you don't have a calculator, you can just do your work off to the side. That gives me 225. I can't simplify the right side anymore, so I'm just going to bring down the C squared. Now comes the last step. You have to find the square root of C, because the opposite of adding is subtracting. The opposite of multiplying is dividing. The opposite of squaring is square rooting. Whatever you do to one side of the equation, you have to do to the other. So if I square root the right side, I have to square root the left. In my calculator, I find the square root of 225, and that's 15 equals C. So my hypotenuse is 15 inches. All right, for problem number 2, we're going to take the triangle, 8 meters, B meters, and 24 meters, and determine what is my C. Well, my C is going to be opposite of my right angle, which is going to be 24. A and B, doesn't matter how you label them. In fact, they actually kind of already tell us that this is side length B we're solving for because they use the variable B. So I'm going to use A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Instead of A, I'm going to put 8. I'm going to keep B squared as B squared because I don't know B. C is going to become 24 squared. This problem looks a little bit different this time because you are solving for a side length instead of the hypotenuse. So I'm going to extend my equal sign and simplify 8 squared, which is 64, plus B squared equals 24 squared is 576. I'm going to solve this like a normal equation where I subtract 64 from both sides. And that gives me B squared equals, well, 576 minus 64, 512. All right, the opposite of squaring is just square root. So I get B equals the square root of 512, which is 22 and 6/10. So we're going to try A, B, and C. So for letter A, I'm going to label 24 as A, 18 as B, and C I'm going to keep as C. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So we have 24 squared plus 18 squared equals C squared. 24 squared is 576, which you may or may not have remembered from the previous problem. If you didn't, that's okay. You can also type that in. 18 squared is 324. I am doing all of these calculations with my calculator. I add them together, that gives me 900. Right side equals C squared. The inverse of squaring is square rooting. Square root of 900 is 30, so C equals 30 yards. Letter B. We have 3 miles, B miles, and 8 miles. My hypotenuse is 8, so that's going to be C. I'll keep B labeled as B, and 3 is going to be A. So A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Replacing my numbers with 3 squared plus B squared equals 8 squared. 9 plus B squared equals 64. I'm going to subtract both sides by 9. That gives me B squared equals 55. The inverse of squaring is square rooting. So the square root of 55 is approximately to the nearest tenth, 7.4. So it's approximately 7.4 miles. All right, for letter C, we have 17 centimeters, A centimeters, and 20 centimeters. I'm going to start by identifying my hypotenuse, which is 20, so that's my letter C. I'm going to label my other two sides. This is already labeled as A, so I'm going to keep it as an A. 17, I'll make it B. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Well, A squared is going to stay that, plus 17 squared equals 20 squared. So 17 squared, so A squared plus 289 equals 400. I'm going to subtract 289 from both sides. A squared equals 111. I want to find the square root of 111 because the opposite of squaring is square rooting. So A equals 10.5 centimeters, rounded to the nearest tenth. So let's look at the converse of the Pythagorean theorem. If the sides of a triangle have lengths a, b, and c units, such that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, then the triangle is a right triangle. So basically that just means they have to work with the Pythagorean theorem for it to be a right triangle. So if you reverse the parts of the Pythagorean theorem, you have formed its converse. So if a triangle is a right triangle, then a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The opposite, the converse, if a squared plus b squared equals c squared, then the triangle is a right triangle. So the converse of the Pythagorean theorem is also true. So let's look at example number 3. We have measures of 3 sides of a triangle, 5 inches, 12 inches, and 13 inches. We're going to determine if this triangle is a right triangle. So I'm going to take the longest side, which is 13 inches, and label that. Then I have 12 inches and 5 inches. It can be labeled in whatever order, that part doesn't matter. So I have a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I'm going to make 5a, 12b, and 13 has to be c because it's the hypotenuse. So 5 squared plus 12 squared equals 13 squared. 5 squared is 25. 12 squared is 144. 125 plus 144 gives me 169. Now, you'll notice I was only focused on the left side. I'll go back to the right side. 13 squared is 169. Well, they both equal each other. Check yes. So this is a right triangle. You'll notice I use a triangle in place of writing out the word triangle. You are allowed to do that. So let's try these 2 problems. Determine whether each triangle with the sides of the given lengths is a right triangle and justify your answer. So I'm going to draw a right triangle, 36, 48, 60. All right, 60 is my hypotenuse. It's the longest side, so I'll label that C. You have 36 miles and then 48 miles. 36 I'll label A, 48 I'll label B. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. 36 squared plus 48 squared equals 60 squared. 36 squared is 1,296. 48 squared is 2,304. When I add those 2 together, that gives me 3,600. 60 squared is 3,600. Check yes, so it is a right triangle because they equal each other. For letter E, we have 7 feet, 5 feet, and 4 feet. 7 is my C because it's the longest side. 5 I'll make my A, and 4 I'll make B. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So 5 squared plus 4 squared equals 7 squared. 25 plus 16 gives us 41. 7 squared is 49. 41 does not equal 49, so it is not a right triangle.